Oh, and I did get the book. Let me see if, there we go. I think you can see that.
I can see it. And coincidentally, you'll be shocked to know that I have it too.
Oh my gosh, who'd have thought?
What a coincidence that we have the same book at the same time.
Oh my gosh, amazing. Well, it's pretty exciting to get the book in the mail. I remember when I got my first book, it's like all that work and it's finally all bound together.
It exists.
It exists. So it is 5 o'clock and I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to start with the crisis lines, which I may repost later. And I'm going to introduce our guest, the esteemed Dr. Stacey Freedenthal, who is a PhD and a licensed clinical social worker, author, and an educator who specializes in helping people with suicidal thoughts. Her new book is Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, What Family, Friends, and Partners Can Say and Do. And Dr. Freedenthal also authored the book, Helping Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, Tips and Techniques for Professionals. And she created and maintains the website, Speaking of Suicide. Dr. Freedenthal is an associate professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work and a psychotherapist in private practice. She lives in Denver, Colorado with her husband and their collection of cats. And do you want to say anything to the audience, Stacey, before we get started?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here, especially my mother, if she's here, because she said she was going to attend. And I see that we also have someone from Belgium, which, wow, long ways away. And I think the title is a tiny bit different from what you said of my first book. It's Helping the Suicidal Person, Tips and Techniques for Professionals. But I love, if I had known in advance I was going to write Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, then it would have been good to name that Helping Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, because that's the distinction between professionals and family and friends. I mean, professionals may feel a sense of love for their clients, but it's not, you know, the same as the way family, friends, and partners do.
All right, I've also put a link. And by the way, I want you guys to be real active in the chat. Please have at it, introduce yourself, tell us who it is. I will download the chat, but it kind of makes us feel like we're not alone talking to our computers all by ourselves. We were talking about that earlier. So we love to have you active in the chat. We are recording. This goes to 6:15. So we're going to kind of stop with my questions at 6 o'clock. If you guys have any questions, at any time you can go to the little Q&A at the bottom and put in your question. It's recording. Okay. We're not real formal here. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to trip over our words. We're going to laugh where we may cry. We're just going to impart a lot of knowledge to help those who are caregivers of those with suicidal thoughts. And I'm going to launch the poll if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. And Stacey, you wanted one more answer to this, but I couldn't fit it on there. So if you would answer the poll, that would be great, just to let us know who you're here about. And it may be more than one, but just the one that best suits who you're looking for help with.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Somebody put in the chat, they asked if you could say how many minutes away we are, because everyone's in different time zones. So you said that we would end at 6:15. So
that would be what, 4:15 Colorado time?
And it's an hour and 10 minutes from now is when this ends.
Exactly. Thank you. I'm not real good with time or calendars. I have a little dyscalculia. So I really struggle there.
Well, I had to check the time when you asked me, you know, what time it was here relative to you.
So I'm going to give the poll about 1 more minute. And meanwhile, I'm checking out the chat and what everybody has to say. Hey, do you want to copy the transcript? I'm recording this with, oh, yes, a copy of the transcript would be wonderful. Thank you. An hour and 10 minutes from now. Thank you, Shauna.
And I do have to say, for my mother, if she's on a cell phone, and she's about as technologically knowledgeable as I am, which means not very. So she probably doesn't know how to put something in the chat on a cell phone. So Mom, you can stop fretting about it if you're there.
All right, so I'm going in poll because we got some answers here. And then I'm going to share the results with all of you all. So I'd say 30% are here for a child, 10% for a parent, 5% are spouse or significant other, sibling, 5% other relative, 10 friend, 25%. Wow, you guys are good friends. 5% coworker, myself, 20%. Thank you for being here. Acquaintance, 20%, and more than one of these, 20%. So as people start to populate this tonight, I figure this will change, but this gives us a good overview of who's in tonight. All right, so there we go. I learned how to cut off a poll just now.
And you can share the results. Do you see that?
Yes, I did, and it must not have shown. So I apologize. Let me see if I can.
It's okay. I did it.
Oh, thank you, being a co-host and all. So you are more technologically capable than I gave you credit for.
Or than I gave myself credit for.
All right.
I am going to stop sharing those so that I can see the screen because it takes up my whole screen.
Same. So I will let you cut that off.
Okay.
So I'm going to go with the first question. What makes people more likely and less likely to become suicidal?
Mm-hmm. How much time do we have?
I'm going to cut you off if you go too long because I got 9 more questions after this.
Well, the things that are, what we would call risk factors for suicidality include mental illness, stress, trauma, sleep problems, hopelessness, perfectionism, loss, especially loss of a relationship, and really many things increase the risk for suicide, or are linked to an increased risk for suicide, and most of them are intuitive. So yeah. Hopelessness, bad; hope, good.
Right. My son had struggled with a sleep disorder. He struggled with depression and anxiety and later addiction. So it was multiple factors that made him more vulnerable to suicide. So a lot of people think it's just one thing when really it's like a myriad of things that makes somebody more vulnerable. So a lot of people say, I'm so afraid of asking about suicide. Will I give them the idea? What if they say yes? And what if they get angry? And what if I say the wrong thing? Those are a lot of questions. So we'll start with the first one. Will I give them the idea?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that because that's such a common fear. A lot of people, I was just sorry, let me not trip over my words. I was just grading an assignment last night where a student wrote that if we reflect how badly someone feels, it might remind them of how bad they feel and make them feel worse, which isn't specific to suicidality. But, the question has to be asked, is the person really not aware of how bad they feel? And if someone is already having suicides, are they not aware of it? of course they're aware of it. So we're not saying anything they don't know when we ask. And if somebody isn't thinking of suicide, I mean, the response I get a lot is, no, I would never think that, or, yeah, I was thinking of suicide, but I ruled it out because X, Y, Z. So that's my anecdotal answer, but my research-based answer is that there have been study after study after study that have looked at, does asking about suicidal thoughts either give somebody the idea or make them feel worse or trigger suicidal behavior, and it doesn't do harm. That's what we know from all these studies. There is a small portion of people who say it may make them feel a little sad or distressed, but it passes in an hour or two. And so the cost of, and that's a very small portion of people, by the way. With most people, that doesn't happen. But even if the person you ask is distressed a little, and I believe that that's a very small price to pay compared to the alternative of not asking and not knowing when somebody is thinking of suicide.
Yeah. What if they get angry, or what if I say the wrong thing?
Yeah. It's been very unusual in my experience that somebody's gotten angry, but then again, I'm a therapist, so a lot of times when I ask, people are expecting it. I did once ask somebody in my office who was crying at the university, and they weren't expecting it, and they didn't seem especially pleased that I was asking this very personal question. And that's okay. It's not the worst thing in the world if somebody gets mad. I mean,
yeah, I've always said I'd rather have somebody mad at me than dead.
And that's what we tell adolescents too, because adolescents, they'll say, oh, I promised my friend I wouldn't tell anybody. And a phrase used with adolescents is better a mad friend than a dead friend. And so if you ask someone if they're thinking of suicide and they get mad, you can repair that. I think a lot of people view it as catastrophic if someone gets mad when they ask something, but you can just say, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. I just really care about you.
Yeah, I like that. That's a nice answer. And I think in terms of the wrong thing, like there are parents who come to me and they say, oh my gosh, you just said this response was not the right thing to say. And I said, let's say you say it in the moment, you can back up and go, oh my gosh, I'm sorry that I'm going back to listening, that, just disregard that dumb comment I made. Or you can go back later and go, I realized that when I said you have so much to live for, I thought I was helping you, when really what I was doing is invalidating your feelings. So I just want to say, I'm sorry for saying that. And I'm here to listen without, my toxic positivity to go with it.
Well, and I want to say about that, repair can be very healing. I mean, there's a whole school of psychotherapy that says therapy doesn't really begin until the therapist does something called an empathic failure, until the therapist does something that fails to connect with the client and may cause upset or anger, because it can be so healing then for the therapist to say, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I missed that. I'm sorry, right. I didn't hear you. And then that can, like you see it too with romantic couples, where sometimes they'll have an argument and they're closer afterwards than they were before, because being able to talk through a problem can strengthen a relationship. There's one other thing I wanted to say about that, Anne, which is about saying the wrong thing. And that's that I was doing a research study in a psychiatric emergency room in Denver. And as part of our institutional review board procedures, we had to, for part of the informed consent process, we had to tell them. And it's possible that some of these questions could be upsetting, or, or they could trigger, other unpleasant emotions. And this one person who was there, because they were intensely suicidal, said, there's nothing you could say to me that could make me feel worse than I already feel. And that was very humbling. It's like, I'm not that important. Their life is bigger than this one conversation. And so I don't mean to poo-poo it if somebody is hurt or upset. I mean, definitely we need to take advantage of that opportunity for repair. But I also am hoping that people will not necessarily be less afraid to ask about suicidal thoughts, but not let fear stop them from asking about suicidal thoughts.
Oh, I could really dig into that one, but I'm going to move on to the next. You cover that really well in the book, by the way. What do I do, and how do I figure out the right thing to do when my loved one is in crisis? It's so hard to figure out. Like, should I call 911 right away?
Yeah, if you go online and you just do a Google search and say, I'm thinking of suicide, or my child is thinking of suicide, you will get thousands of websites that say to call 911 or go to an emergency room immediately. And I really want to encourage people to take a step back and not immediately go into emergency mode unless there is an emergency. And now you might be saying, well, so how do I know if there's an emergency? Well, obviously this list isn't going to be all inclusive, but if the person's already made an attempt, if they have a weapon, if they're out of control behaviorally, if they're intoxicated and are out of control, all of these could be instances where, yeah, they need emergency help. But very often, very, very, very often, we can sit down and have a conversation with the person, and we can listen to what's going on with them. And I don't mean to be simplistic and say listening cures everything, because it certainly doesn't. I wish it did. But there are many people for whom listening, it doesn't cure them, but it gives them hope. It's like, okay, so I'm not alone. And this person is trying to help me and trying to understand, and maybe even they are understanding me. And so it can be really disconnecting to immediately push the person away to an emergency room or to call the police. And then, of course, calling the police has its own set of problems, especially in the United States, where police violence is not as rare as it is in other countries.
Well, also, if you're a person of color, then maybe those interactions with police have not been very positive. And it's a risk, you're adding additional risk. So I have one example where a friend of mine called me from a bridge, and she had told me about a previous incident with the police, and it did not go well. She was in a pretty small town. I figured out which bridge she was on, but made the decision not to call the police because she was continuing to talk to me. I was afraid that maybe I made the wrong decision, but I thought if the police showed up, that would be the last of, let's call her Pamela. And so we just talked back and forth. And then I could tell she was coming out of it when she said, it feels cold out here, because prior to that, she didn't feel cold. So I was waiting for that moment where I'm like, I bet it's warm. Do you have a heater in your car? And it worked out, and she was able to call me once she got to her apartment, and I was able to follow up with her the next day to see if she was okay. And then there was another incident where a mom called me and her daughter was in the corner unresponsive all day. And I said, well, before you call 911, see if she'll just get in the car with you and you go to get some help, because she was not responding at all. And so that was their solution instead of the back of an ambulance, which could have been traumatizing, to certain individuals. And that seemed to be a good solution at that time. And it's really hard in those moments of stress to think through what's the right thing to do. So kind of thinking through now of just what we've talked about and these basic things that you can do before you take that step, then, you feel better prepared. But of course, if somebody is sitting in your living room and they have a firearm in their hand, you may not have a choice. You might, and of course, you don't want to put yourself in danger either. And I think that's real important for everyone to know. So,
can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
because I think everything you said is spot on, and it's the least intrusive or least invasive measure possible is always what we strive for in mental health treatment, and I think we should everywhere. But I do want to say that sometimes it is necessary to call the police or an ambulance or take someone to the emergency room. And in those instances, it's important just to be as collaborative as you can, to give choices where you can. Like, would you rather go to this hospital or that hospital? Would you rather that I call the police and your family, or just the police? You know what I mean? Like, wherever you can give choices, and wherever we can tell them what to expect next, it is going. I mean, and that's part of trauma-informed practice too. Is the more collaborative you can be, the more in control the person can feel, the less surprises there are, then the better it is.
Well, I like the fact that you're giving them agency. I mean, we talk about that with kids in school and school counselors, offering them the opportunity. Okay, I have to call your parent. Do you want to be in the room when do you want to tell them yourself? Do you want me to?
Yes.
But allowing them to have that choice. And if they make the choice to tell the parent, would you like to practice what you would say with me before we call them, and knowing that I will be with you the whole time?
Yes.
So
yes.
I think giving people agency in those moments, it just shows a level of respect that I think is really important, because it can feel, from talking to people who struggle with suicidal thoughts, and I know you have in the past many years ago, that you feel very, very vulnerable, and you feel like, will they think I'm weak? And things like that just validate that you don't think of the person that way, that you do know they are capable of making decisions because they've asked you for help. And that's a really, really brave step. And I hope everyone understands how much courage it takes to share the deepest, darkest feelings in your soul with another human being. It's got to just feel. I know when I was grieving and I asked for help after my son died by suicide, it was really hard for me to ask for help and say, I need support right now. And it just made me feel really naked.
Hence, emotionally naked.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, Elaine, the recording will be available later. So number 4, I'm afraid when my loved one is talking about suicide, and I'm afraid when they are not. It's like I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I can't find any peace. How can I get myself out of this cycle?
Yeah, again, how much time do we have?
I know this. I've written lots of articles on this.
So it's really hard, when you know or you suspect that somebody has suicidal thoughts, and then from day to day, you don't know, are they withholding them? Are they, kind of like damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they tell you they're having suicidal thoughts, you may stress about that. But if they don't, then you're even more stressed because you're worried that they're hiding it. So I would say ways to deal with it are, one way is to keep the lines of communication open, and talk with the person who has suicidal thoughts about what's the best way to check in with them. And sometimes I say this in my book, sometimes people will adopt a form of shorthand where they'll say, are you safe right now? And what they really mean is, are you in danger of acting on suicidal thoughts right now? But it's just a very quick and easy way. And I don't mean to perpetuate stigma against suicide. I mean, this is in the context, or against talking about suicide. This is in the context of there's already been communication about suicide, and the person, just doesn't want to every day be asked this really long, time-consuming or emotionally heavy question, and saying, are you safe right now, can get at the same information. And then also asking the person what would help them to tell you, like maybe they have a shorthand for you where they can come to you and say, I'm not safe right now. And those are just examples. I mean, I realize
Right.
it's the same example in a different variation, but it could be whatever. I mean, it could
Yeah.
be, there could be a magic word, the umbrella with the aardvarks,
Right.
whatever can help facilitate communication and facilitate the process. And then if the person does shut you out, which happens, that's
Yeah.
really, really hard, because ultimately we cannot extract something from somebody that they do not want to give when it comes to emotions or communication. I mean, sure, something physical we can take away, but we cannot force someone to tell us their truth.
Right.
There's not a truth detector test that does that. And so if they shut us out, then it's important to try not to get into a power struggle with them, because, when you engage in a power struggle, the person with the most power wins.
Right.
But then both people can lose.
And they can dig their heels in.
Exactly.
And so one of the things I tell people is to be vulnerable, like especially with parents and child relationship, like, oh my gosh, they didn't answer my text, and you've got them in ICU in the ER in your mind because they haven't answered immediately. So you're kind of making this other person uncomfortable by, pouncing on them every time they come in the door. And I tell my moms and dads, you just need to sit down and go, I am not handling this one. In fact, I'm kind of doing a real sucky job of it right now. And the thought of losing you is really frightening me, terrifying me. And so I'm going to go get help for myself and find support. And I found that I can go to NAMI Family Group, and there's one in our area, and there's also one online. And I'm going to start to go to that so that I kind of back off. And maybe we can have a conversation about how my behavior is kind of annoying you, driving you crazy, or, making you want to stay away from the house more. And because this is an honest two-way conversation. So getting help for yourself and being vulnerable. And you're also modeling seeking help as a sign of strength when you do that, which I think is really, really powerful.
Definitely. And I mean, I think what you said is so important, because especially I see this with parents, if the parents are so upset and so worried and so, for lack of a better word, kind of overbearing with their child who has suicidal thoughts, then the child might not tell them anymore because they don't want to freak out their parents. So or they might get into a caretaking role with their parents where they're like, no, don't worry, I won't do anything, I promise, you don't need to worry. But in the back of their mind, they're thinking, if she really knew what I thought, she'd really be freaking out. You know what I mean? So it's really almost a question of boundaries, that the parents need to take care of themselves so that they can be more present to take care of the other person, and not just the parent, any loved one of somebody with suicidal thoughts. They need to work out their feelings and fears and stuff too, so that then they can be more present.
Jen made the point, don't freak out, which is super important. I tell my parents that, first thing you need to do is that they're afraid to tell you because they're afraid you're going to freak out. And so I think that's a really good point. So question number 5, how could they even consider suicide if they have kids and a family? Sometimes I feel like I'm worthless or I don't matter at all. Isn't suicide a choice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And by the way, my saying isn't yes, suicide is a choice, but yes, those are very painful questions. And I've seen this described different ways, but rationally, sure, having children is a reason to live. The people who love you could be reasons to live. But the suicidal mind isn't rational, and it's not. I personally believe it ultimately, I mean, there are aspects of suicide that are a choice, so I'm not going to say blanketly it's not, but there are many instances where it can feel like a choice, but the situation in the person's life, or the pain that they're experiencing, or the sleeplessness, or the mental illness, or the addiction, or whatever other challenge they're experiencing, has made it that they're not seeing things realistically. And in clinical terms, we call it cognitive constriction, where they're not, it's like tunnel vision, and they're not seeing all the other things around them, and they're only able to just home in on, I'm going to be simplistic here, and let's say it's pain. They're homing in on their pain, and all they're thinking is, I want the pain to end. I want the pain to end. And I compare it to a tornado. In one of my blog posts, I titled it, "Is it selfish to die in a tornado?" Because somebody had died by suicide, and in the media, a columnist wrote about how selfish she was. And I was just furious, because her husband had been murdered a few days before while he was jogging. And I'm sorry, people, if this is triggering, but it's to illustrate the gravity of the situation. He was jogging by their home, and he was murdered by a stranger with a machete. So not only did her husband die, and they were in their 30s or 40s, not only did her husband die, but he died in this incredibly traumatic, world turning over kind of way. And just a few days later, she killed herself, and somebody had the nerve to say she was selfish. And I was just so mad. And so I wrote this essay about, there are forces bigger than us, and it's like a tornado. If a tornado comes and it carries someone away, we don't say, oh, they were so selfish for not holding on tighter to the tree. Or, they were so selfish for managing to get carried away by the tornado. And I think sometimes we blame the victim when somebody dies by suicide, or even thinks of suicide, in the same way.
Yeah, and I remember feeling like, why did my son leave me? Didn't he know we love him? And it just took a really long time. And I went to overnight walks, and I just talked to as many people with lived experience as I could find. And they so generously shared their stories. And that really was part of my growth and healing. And if it weren't for those stories and those beautiful people that shared their pain and how they had come back from it, I don't know that I would have understood it, but it really, really helped. And I'm grateful for that. So for anybody on the call today who struggles, thank you if you tell those of us who don't really understand, and to help us understand. It's most appreciated. All right,
I had a dramatic...
Pull
Yes,
myself together. I'm getting all red and smoky over here.
well, and I want to acknowledge your tears and your sadness, because it's just such a sad topic and situation.
It is.
And I also want to say that, I couldn't remember what I was going to say, but I pulled it back. I pulled the memory back. And that's that on my website, speaking of suicide.com, there was an extraordinary conversation in the comments section once a few years ago. And readers have left 10,000 comments on that website. So I've thought about, like, how can I make this a forum where it can be even more interactive? But anyway, I don't remember who started it, but it ended up being kind of like this debate between a man with suicidal thoughts and a woman whose son had killed himself, and her son was the same age as this man. And they were like, kind of, if I'm remembering correctly, they were kind of arguing in the comments to try to get each other to see the other's point of view. And then finally she had this epiphany where she said, oh my God. I mean, like, it gives me goosebumps to remember it. Oh my God, this is helping me to understand my son's state of mind.
Wow.
And she said the conversation was really healing.
Yeah, I've got thousands and thousands of comments, both on YouTube and on my blog. And I've learned a lot from there too. And lots of times people struggling will support each other. Yeah. But it's a nice place where people come together and that have somebody struggling, they struggle themselves or they've lost someone. And it kind of helps everybody understand it from that point of view, which I think is something we need to do more of these days.
It helps, but it also has the potential to not help. If somebody is a lost survivor and they say to somebody with suicidal thoughts, you're being so selfish, how could you think of hurting people like that? Like, then that can activate other challenges.
And that's why they have to be moderated. Unfortunately, I've had a couple of those, but they're obviously not published because that's just, is somebody in their grief really not understanding yet? And they haven't yet reached that place of understanding, and hopefully they will one day.
And their lack of understanding is valid too. Like, I don't want to say that their feelings,
exactly.
Like anger at the person for leaving. I mean, from a distance, I can, kind of in a clinically detached way, feel like, well, depression deserves the anger, or the situations deserve the anger. But I'm not going to, someone who's just had somebody die, I'm not going to say, you shouldn't be angry. You should be angry at the illness or, the situation. So it's complex because, feelings can be valid even when people have contrasting or conflicting feelings.
Well, anger and grief is common, and I run a suicide loss support group. And at some point, people do struggle with anger. I know my son did after his brother died by suicide. And I remember I just accepted that that's how he felt. I had to accept where he was in the process because he was so good about accepting where I was in the process. And we were never, my husband, my older son, and me, we were never on the same page at the same time. And coming to kind of understand that, it took a while to get used to all of it. So my loved one lives with persistent suicidal thoughts. Is there any hope they can lead a normal life? How does somebody get used to a loved one struggling with thoughts of suicide?
It would surprise many people how many folks out there have been thinking of suicide for years and even decades. Yeah. And there are people, there's a lot of people. I mean, for me, my first suicidal thoughts were when I was 11 or 12, and I've worked with and also met outside of my professional relationships, people whose suicidal thoughts started when they were very young, like 4 or 5. And they can become a way of life in a way, like, just something that is normal to the person to have suicidal thoughts, but it's not normal to the people who care about that person. So I would say, yes, it's very possible for someone to have what was the phrase you used? Is it possible for my loved one to?
Is it possible for my loved one to lead a normal life?
Yeah, well, normal is a relative term, but it's possible for a loved one to lead a life where they're functioning and succeeding and even maybe happy in work and love, and to still have suicidal thoughts. And there's more people who do that than we know. One thing about suicidal thoughts, and we're just starting to do more research on this, and we've got a lot of theory, but not as much empirical evidence. But there's a theory that suicidal thinking can become a habit, in that it's reinforced, because when somebody's in distress, if they start thinking of killing themselves and the idea isn't frightening to them, then it can actually give them some kind of peace or relief to know that they have an option, and it can make them feel more in control. Like, well, if things ever get that bad, then I can do this. And so now their brain has gotten some relief. And so it's the same way that anything becomes a habit. You get a reward from it. And so over time, somebody's thinking about suicide can become so automatic that it's not even a choice. It's not like they're entertaining the thought and they choose to think of suicide. It comes to them.
Right. And then there are people that live with the persistent thoughts. There are people who have the thought one time in their life and then it never happens again. Then there are people who may have it 3 times over their whole lifespan. It is really all over the map, and in terms of that struggle. So, and not everybody's the same. Everybody's journey is really different. I mean, there are some common threads, but it could be that somebody does get kind of past it or learns to compartmentalize it in a way. Like Frank King uses it
I
as
was
a joke
thinking of
all the
him.
time.
I was thinking
Like,
of him.
I could change my tire or I could kill myself. So he just kind of uses it as this flippant joke thing that, and not to say that people joking about suicide aren't serious, because they are, but he's figured out that's his way of coping. And that's his way of reminding himself that it's a thought. I don't have to make that thought an action. And he does that in one of his TED Talks, as you and I both know.
Absolutely. And I think it's called Suicide, a Matter of Laugh or Death. Can't remember the title. But if others want to look it up, it's Frank King, and
right.
I think it's Laugh or Death, something like that. But one of the most powerful things, and it is so simple, it's going to sound really funny how simple this is. It's like, oh, wow, you got, you went to graduate school to learn this. Kind of like looking at a Picasso painting of a circle and going, I could do that. But you're not Picasso. One of the things that has been really, really helpful for a lot of people that I work with is to preface the thought that they have, like, they have a thought, life is never going to get better, I should kill myself. Then to repeat that to themselves, but preface it with, I am having the thought that life is never going to get better. I am having the thought that I should kill myself. And this gives them the ability to kind of observe their thoughts rather than to kind of completely buy into their thoughts. Do you see what I mean? So, I mean, it's sort of like if I say to you, oh, I left my keys in my car. Well, that's truth, right? I left my keys in the car. But if I say to you, I'm having the thought that I left my keys in the car, well, then you're going to think, well, maybe she did, maybe she didn't, so if they can build in that kind of witnessing part of themselves, that can be a way to cope with suicidal thoughts, just like the way you said that, then they can, like with Frank King, that then they can be like, oh, this is the way I'm coping right now.
Right.
It's I'm having these thoughts because I'm really stressed. And what do I need to do about that stress?
A friend of mine wrote herself a letter, like a love letter, and it's published on the blog. Anna Weeder wrote it, and people look it up all the time. And I've linked it to some other pages. But it's a really lovely letter about what she tells herself. And if she can't remember it, she goes back and she reads the letter. And it hasn't helped her every time, because one time she read it and she reached out to me, but it has helped her most of the time. So I'm going to ask number 8. I go through all these motions, drop everything for the current crisis, and then everything is fine. It's exhausting, and I'm starting to think my loved one has gotten addicted to saying they're suicidal. How can I know that I'm not being manipulated, or are they just trying to get attention?
Yeah, that's a big. What'd you say?
I said cringe. I can't stand it when people say they're just trying to get attention.
I know. And in my book, I have a chapter that's titled If You Feel Manipulated. And I'm very careful throughout the chapter to say, if you feel manipulated, or you feel manipulated, because not you are manipulated, because what is it? Marshall Linehan said, just because you feel manipulated doesn't mean you are.
Right.
Or doesn't mean the person's manipulating you.
That was a very good chapter, because as a writer myself, I could tell how careful you had to be. And I know that took some rewrites to be respectful of those who struggle with the thoughts, but also acknowledge that sometimes people do feel that way. And it has been used not often, but there are the slim percentage of people who will use it manipulatively and at times. And I probably am not saying that with the gentle enough words that I should use, but
Well, they're using it. Suicidal communications can get results, you know, and it's not necessarily that the person is seeking attention, but people do get attention when their life is in danger, rightly
right.
so. And what I say when someone says they're just doing that for attention is I say, well, it's not the healthiest way to get attention if they are using suicidal communications to get attention. There are much healthier ways to get attention, you know, so there's still a problem, even if that's what they're doing. Where things are tricky, I think, and definitely that chapter was one of the hardest things I've ever written. I mean, I remember one time at 3 a.m, I woke up and I texted a friend of mine who had a loved one die by suicide and said, you know, I'm working through this example and, you know, is this sensitive? Is this okay? Because like I was thinking of all the different people who might read that chapter, you know, somebody who's got suicidal thoughts, someone who lost somebody to suicide, and someone who has a loved one currently suicidal. They all have different needs and different vantage points. And one thing that is really important, and that made that chapter so hard, is it's not either or. You know, often somebody who has suicidal thoughts, they're not manipulating at all, and the situation makes the person feel manipulated.
And
You know,
they need attention.
right.
And that's not a bad thing. I mean, I tell most parents, please don't say that, you know, to your child. You're just trying to get attention, because it makes, how does somebody get help if they don't get some attention?
I'm having an image in my mind while you're talking, Ann Moss, and I'm sorry, I think I called you Ann before instead of Ann Moss, but I'm having an image in my mind of you come upon a lake and there's someone drowning in the lake and they're shouting, help, help. And you look at them and you say, they just want attention.
Right. Exactly. I mean, in any other situation, we wouldn't, you know, brush it off. And I think lots of times we do that because we don't want to deal with it, or we parents say things like, and I'm not, you know, I understand parents saying this as well. So, but things like, oh, she's such a drama queen, you know, and then the kid will come back and say, I told my mom, but she said I was a drama queen. And I'm like, all right, she doesn't understand. Maybe you need to put it in writing or find another trusted adult, like your school counselor, and then it'll kind of validate your feelings. And having another adult with you will help them understand that you need help and you asked, and that was a brave and noble, you know, move that you made, and they just need a little education. It's not that they don't love you or that they don't care.
Right, they're scared.
They're scared.
Just to finish a thought that I started before, so it's not like floating in my head and tickling my brain, is that it's often not either or. You know, there are cases where it is, where it's clear cut, the person is not manipulating, they don't have any manipulative intent. The situation might make somebody else feel manipulated, but it's, you know, it's the person drowning in the lake calling for help. You know, if you walk by a lake, you know, here I am, I'm on my daily walk, I have somewhere I need to be in an hour, and I see someone drowning in the lake. Well, is it manipulative that now I'm going to change my plans and my behavior to help them? Have they manipulated me into helping them? No, the situation influenced my choice to help them. And there are some people, like you said, a very small percentage, who do use suicidal communications. And in the most obvious example is somebody who says to their partner, if you leave me, I'll kill myself and it'll be all your fault. And they're trying to get the partner not to leave. What I found so difficult in writing that chapter, and so difficult just in life in general, is the people who might be in the middle. They don't have manipulative intent, but what they say on the face of it looks manipulative. Like the person who says, if you leave me, I'll kill myself. That looks really manipulative and emotionally abusive, right? But what if that really is their truth? Like, oh my God, if you leave me, I'll be all alone. No one's ever going to love me. I'm worthless. I'm hopeless. I won't be able to survive. And it's not we know objectively, from the outside that it's not the other person's fault, but they may feel responsible based on someone saying, if you leave me, I'll kill myself. And so now you've gotten into this quagmire where one person feels manipulated and angry, and the other person is trying to speak their truth, but it's coming off as manipulative, and things can just, be very, very difficult in those contexts.
Yeah, and I think you handled a lot of so in that chapter, she has a lot of scenarios and stories and examples, because there's so many little different kind of changes and differences in those stories, and how to address that in each of those cases. So good job on that.
Well, thank you.
So I want to go to number 9. If my loved one goes to a therapist, what should I expect in the way of deliverables? And I put deliverables, it's a business term, but what am I going to get back in terms of a plan, or what I can do to help, etc. So talking about assessments and safety plans and evaluations, tell me where you are on that.
I will. Hold on one moment, Anne. Okay, I just need to do something.
Sure.
Okay. It's super hot in my room, so I needed to open the window a bit more. It's going to depend. I mean, it's going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend on what the therapist's theoretical orientation is. It's going to depend on the age of the client. So like if you're a parent, you're going to be entitled to information in many states, not all states, but depending on the age of the child. And also the person's choice, as a client, especially for adults, as a client, do they want the therapist to talk with their loved ones? Do they want to involve other people in their care? And it's their choice unless there's an emergency. And then when there's an emergency, the rules of confidentiality don't apply. And the therapist can involve loved ones to the extent that's necessary to help the person. It's not like everything's, now the therapist can spill all the person's secrets. No, but the therapist can call and say, I have, I'm just going to use this as an example. I have your partner in my office and they've taken pills, and I've called 911 and we need to know what kind of pills they took. Could you please look at the bottles in the bathroom? That kind of thing, something very specific. So there's all these variables, but let's pretend that the person consents to your being a support for them and consents to your getting information from the therapist. Ideally, there will be a safety plan. Not all therapists do this, but that is what's recommended now. And a safety plan is where the person comes up with an advance. I mean, there's a formal safety plan at suicidesafetyplan.com if anyone wants to look there. But there's also other kinds of safety plans, and there's also just informal safety plans where it's not charted the way it is in the suicidesafetyplan.com plan. And by the way, that plan was developed by Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown. And I just learned today that Barbara Stanley died, I believe today or yesterday.
Oh my gosh.
I know, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have sprung that in the middle of the webinar. I just learned it like an hour before. She had cancer. So, but anyway. Okay, Stacey, you're getting tangential. Okay, but anyway, so the safety plan, if there is a safety plan, that would be a reasonable quote deliverable. I don't really use that term in therapy, but you've taught me something. Also, a treatment plan. There should be a treatment plan where the therapist identifies what the key problems are. Depending on their theoretical orientation, they'll assign a diagnosis to the person. There's, especially among psychodynamic therapists, there are people who shy away from diagnosis. Also, a lot of empowerment and feminist-based models view diagnosis as pathologizing or labeling. I personally find that argument to be stigmatizing people with mental illness, because they're saying, oh no, don't diagnose because it's so bad. It's like, well, but diagnose people, if they have an illness, they have an illness, you know. So so treatment plan, safety plan, there is something called a hope kit that some therapists use, not all, but some, where they ask the person to, it can be a fun creative project, or it could just be something they have on their phone, where they put together reminders of what their reasons are for living, or of things that they're hopeful for in the future. And then another thing is coping statements. Some therapists use this as a technique where they ask the person to kind of talk back to their suicidal thoughts, and, you know, what could they say to them when they're in a suicidal crisis. And you know, and I wrote a blog post about this. One person, they gave themselves a 3-day rule, where they said, okay, I have to go 3 days consistently at the same level wanting to die before I act on anything. And invariably their desire to die dips at least a little, and they have to start the clock over. And they said they've never, ever gone 3 whole days. Now, the problem with that is some people do go 3 days, you know, and so I wouldn't want to convey, okay, if you go 3 days, you know, I mean, what that means to me is you need more help, not you need to act on your suicidal thoughts. So these are all some things. There, you know, there's different concrete things that therapists use, and then there's some therapists who just don't. Somebody on Twitter about 2 months ago started this huge uproar, a student, I believe, and she tweeted that she will never give clients tools because that's not why she's getting her doctorate. And then all these people wrote, I mean, huge viral tweet. And all these people wrote back and said, get back with me in 10 to 20 years and tell me if you still feel that way.
Right. That's interesting. And one thing I think is important for people to understand, you can do the basic parts of a safety plan with your loved one. I mean, if you have one from a therapist, that's great. But if you don't, this is something you can try to do together, you know.
Absolutely. The professional advice is do it with a professional, but I will tell you, our son doesn't mind my sharing this experience because he thinks it can help people to know that our son went through suicidal crises too as an adolescent. And one time in the emergency room, a psychiatrist handed us a safety plan and said, I'm going to go take care of these people, fill this out while I'm gone. He didn't know that my husband and I are both therapists. I mean, my husband's not practicing as a therapist, but he's a psychologist, and he didn't know that. And so, you know, not only can you do it, you might be asked to do it with the person you care about. And I would say it's a good conversation to have. Like, even if it's not, you know, again, even if it's not formal, it's a really good conversation to have with somebody. You know, here I'm going to use the Stanley Brown safety plan to ask them, what are the triggers? What are the warning signs that you might be thinking of suicide? You know, and if that happens, what can you do to distract yourself or take care of yourself? What's something I could remind you of, you know? And then, you know, the next part is who are people and places, and what are places you could go to for distraction. So first it's distracting yourself alone, then it's distracting yourself in company with others or in another place, but not necessarily asking for help. Just, you know, this is an intermediate step. And then the next step would be, who can you ask for help? Because sometimes the people they go to for distraction are different than the people they go to for help.
Right.
And this is a great conversation to have because, you know, we were talking before about emergency intervention. You could say, you know, so if you are in need of help, like, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to take you to an emergency room? Do you want me to call your therapist? Do you want me to just sit and be with you? You know, what do you need? Those are good conversations to have in advance. What's that John Kennedy quote? The best time to fix a leaky roof is when it's not raining.
Right, exactly.
You know?
All right, I got to cut you off and you have about 1 minute to explain what brave listening is. And while you're doing that, I'm going to look at the question and answer that
Sure.
people have posted.
Let me just say one thing about safety planning. There's planning. There's also a part about keeping the environment safe, which would be like if you have firearms
Yeah.
or pills or things. So I didn't want to leave that off.
It's called means removal. So I think that's important. Removing means. Okay.
Yeah, or access to means things. Some people say means restriction, but then that's viewed as like depriving people of their rights to frame it that way. Brave listening. I have it in my book. I did a reading the other night, and I liked the way that this line sounded when I read it aloud, because so I'm gonna see if I can find it handily. I say that brave listening. It takes courage to ask questions whose answers you fear. So does listening to what hurts to hear. So brave listening is hearing another person describe their pain without immediately jumping in to tell them they're wrong, or things get better, or here's how to fix the situation, or they shouldn't feel that way, they've got so much going for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we have a human instinct to help people to feel better, partly because we're scared, but also partly because we don't want to see somebody hurt. And then also because if somebody's hurt, they might pull us into their hurt. And that's where bravery is required, to sit with somebody and hear what they have to say without shutting them down. You know, to listen to what they have to say and to respond in ways that encourage them to open up more rather than to shut down. That's what I call brave listening. And, you know, the clinical terms are active listening, empathic listening, reflective listening, but I really think it takes bravery to be able to be with somebody in their pain rather than to try to immediately pull them out of it.
Thank you.
Did I do it in a minute?
Close. You did it in almost a minute. So I'm going to ask some of these questions. I did screenshot them, so we'll answer them in some way at some point if we don't get to all of them. And my partner is in constant chronic pain from complex health issues. How do I cope with the guilt of being his reason for staying alive? Oh,
that's a hard question. That's a really hard question. And I assume the person who asked that is having suicidal thoughts themselves. Is that what you're inferring from the question?
I think it's how do I cope with the guilt of being his reason for living? In other words, he's struggling, he's in pain, and he doesn't want to be alive, but he's staying alive for my sake, is how I read it.
Oh, I misunderstood. I thought they meant they have suicidal thoughts and they want to die, but they're this person's reason for living, so they can't and they feel guilty. But I see what you mean, that they feel guilty.
I'm going to copy and paste this question in the chat. There you go.
No easy answer,
no,
as the person expects. But I think part of that could be, that's a big load to carry, to be somebody's only reason for living, and especially if they're in pain and you're feeling like you're prolonging their pain because they're staying alive for you. So I would encourage, at a minimum, an open conversation with brave listening to really hear what their partner is thinking and feeling, and then also for them to bravely listen to the person who asked the question, you know, for there to be mutual brave listening, so that they're operating from knowledge rather than fears.
I like that. I think that's a good answer. Is there a website you can recommend with up-to-date suicide statistics? She's checked afesp.org and about suicide statistics. That's a tough one because there's so many different statistics. What would you suggest, Stacey?
I am going to put in the chat, there's something called Whiskers, WSQARS, and it's an interactive tool from the Centers for Disease Control. They've also got a data set called Wonder, but I use Whiskers. It's for violent deaths, and they've got statistics through right now 2020, but 2021 statistics will be released at any moment, if maybe even they were in the last couple of days. I haven't checked, but there is a lag with statistics because it can take a while
Right.
to resolve differences and things like that. But Whiskers is where I go for up-to-date information in the United States. And then the World Health Organization, they don't have the same website where you can run your own data analyses like Whiskers, but they do compile statistics from around the world. And so that's where I go for international stats.
Okay, thank you. And I didn't know about Whiskers, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I
All
put
right.
that name because the web address is really long, and I just always put Whiskers in Google and it takes me there. But Whiskers with WISQARS, not,
Okay.
other Whiskers.
All right. My daughter is 18 years old and had a suicide attempt on Sunday. She's getting inpatient treatment right now. What can I expect when she comes home? Any suggestions for me and my family to prepare as she returns home? First of all, my heart's with you, Tammy. I'll put the question in the chat. What kind of answer or thoughts do you have for Tammy for preparing when her daughter comes home? And I know you're overwhelmed, Tammy. It's a very overwhelming feeling.
Yeah. There's a lot of different layers to that because there's emotional things to expect. There's kind of practical things to expect. I mean, the emotional things are that you're probably going to be afraid. You're probably going to be afraid to let her out of your sight, or afraid that she's hiding something from you, or afraid that, afraid that she'll attempt suicide again. And so being able to work through that fear, not necessarily with your daughter, but getting help and learning ways to manage that fear. You may have anger. You may be angry that she didn't come to you, or that, there's all sorts of things you might be angry about. And so just, being prepared for the emotional aspect, but then there's also practical things to consider. And one of those is getting things out of the house that could be used as a weapon. And I'm not really able to read the chat, and I apologize, I'm just too distractible, but every now and then I have kind of looked to see, and I know somebody said you can't always remove things from the house, and that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a client say to me once, a teenager, she said, you can't suicide proof the world. And that was a humbling moment, because I was like, she's right.
Yeah.
And so you do the best you can. And one of the things we did with our son, and actually the emergency room provided us with this, they gave us a safe that's like this big. And we put knives and pills and things like that in the safe. I have a post on my website where I say it's about our limitations, and that it can be really, really devastating to realize that we're limited in what we can do to stop someone, but it also can be liberating, because then we're not asking ourselves to be perfect and superhuman. And what I say in that blog post about our limitations is, do everything you can, but know you can't do everything. And so I think that can be part of the both practical and emotional accommodation that someone can make. And then another thing to consider is that their daughter may not want to talk about what happened, and you might want to, or you might be one of the many, many, many people that research shows that never brings it up, and your daughter might want to talk about what happened. So I think it would be better to ask the question and be rebuffed. And by that, I mean to ask what happened, what are you feeling, what were you feeling? It would be better to ask and be rebuffed and then give the person their space, than to not ask and you're wanting to know and they're wanting to tell you but neither of you is crossing the bridge to the other.
I also think it's easier to do that if you've shared some vulnerability about yourself in the past. So it might take them a while to get to that place. So sharing some kind of vulnerability about yourself, because they're not going to open up if you don't.
Right.
You know, and I don't mean big things like we're going to lose the house or I'm going to lose my job, because that's really scary. Small things, I'm struggling, I'm starting this new job and I'm feeling very anxious. A random hug would really help, if you don't mind. So you're asking for their help and also saying what you do to help me is important. And when you get a hug, when somebody gives you a random hug like that, what happens? You just turn into a noodle. It's just like wonderful, especially, from somebody you care about. So I think that's one thought. Jen asked, how do we find treatment that doesn't just deal with symptoms and surface issues? And a follow-up to that, it seems like trauma-informed therapy is very hard to find. How do we advocate for our person to get them that kind of treatment?
Yeah, there can be so many hurdles to getting that kind of treatment. One thing I would say is I really recommend the collaborative assessment and management of suicidality if you have a CAMS provider in your area. And you can look up, I think it's camscare.com, but I may be wrong. And they've got a therapist locator where you can enter where you live, and they'll tell you if there are people in your area who have that training. But CAMS Care operates from the philosophy that is supported by research, by the way, that suicidality should be treated first. It shouldn't be treated as a symptom of a problem. It should be treated as, the person has to stay alive for other things to get better. So let's focus on the suicidality. There are other therapists who say, well, if we cure the depression, or, if we treat the depression, the suicidal thoughts will go away. Well, let's, focus on the suicidality. So CAMS is a treatment that really focuses on it. And otherwise, I would suggest if CAMS isn't available where you are, I would suggest really doing due diligence and trying to find a therapist who's received training in helping suicidal people, who doesn't panic if somebody has suicidal thoughts. I'm very sad to say there are therapists who won't treat people who have suicidal thoughts. And on the one hand, that makes me sad and even angry because the therapists are putting their needs before other people's needs. But on the other hand, better to know that than to go to them.
Right, exactly. And we are doing, I'm doing 2 trainings with Kim O'Brien on suicide risk assessment and safety planning. And it's for clinicians. And, we do this together, and we're doing one that's virtual and one that is in person in Richmond, Virginia, because we recognize that we want to give our licensed clinical social workers those tools to feel confident enough for helping people with suicidal thoughts, because that's a gap. Everybody is so booked up, and we want more licensed clinical social worker to have those skills.
Yes.
And I
definitely.
know you've done a lot of training, so appreciate your efforts there. All right, we're at 6:13. You got about a minute, and I'm not sure anyway. When somebody tells me her suicidal thoughts, it should mean they consider me safe enough to share. Yet if I don't feel like having the right energy myself to support them, how could I help them without making myself without a mistake and worsen their situation with my answer? I teach Safe Talk, and what we say in Safe Talk, if you are not in that space, then you do a warm handoff. You just, say, I want you to have the help that you need, and I'm going to introduce you to, someone in our area. And it really helps to have somebody, like a local county, you know, line, or find a friend who's equally as supportive. What is your thought there, Stacey?
Yeah, I'm thinking while you're talking that it's such a double bind, because on the one hand, if you try to help somebody when you don't have the capacity, you may not be effective
Right.
at helping them. And if you tell them you don't have the capacity, then they could feel hurt. And then that could be a complication. So I think, it's going to depend on the person and the situation. But if it's something, people get triggered and say somebody just lost a family member to suicide, in the last, few years or few decades, whatever the case is, and they don't feel like they can be present for a friend who has suicidal thoughts because it brings up so much emotional pain for them. That's a boundary, and so they could say, it's not about you. I just think that based on my own experience, I can't be present with you when you're talking about your suicidal thoughts, and I want you to be able to speak freely and not be worried about hurting me or triggering me. So who could I help you connect with? Do you want me to help you find a therapist? Do you want me to help you talk with somebody else about this? Or, what can I do to help, even though I don't have the capacity to help the way I might like to right now?
Thank you. That's a great answer. All right, we are at 6:16, so we are a little behind here. I just posted where you can find Stacey and her book, and she is active mostly on Twitter. And got to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight. I really appreciate it. And those who signed up will get the recording, and you'll also get a recording as well if you're here. Bye-bye, everyone.